It's a real pleasure to be here, and I appreciate the invitation. So as Dee mentioned, I'm a child psychologist, and my research program is dedicated to children's safety. A piece of it is in agricultural safety, and I'll allude to that several times during this talk. But to give you some of the bigger picture, I'm a child psychologist interested in injury prevention for children. So, well, I may need some help here.
It's around the circle part.
I don't think the arrows are working. Did you do that, or did I? You did? Okay. I'll just tell you. All right, so what is development? How do children change? So, of course, development refers to children's growth and change over time. I think most of this is familiar to you. Children are not the same as miniature adults. They develop, and here we're talking especially about the brain developing and how does the brain change from childhood through adolescence and adulthood. I think a key thing to remember is development is necessary. This is human nature. In order for you to drive a car, you got to take that risk and turn the key for the first time. In order to walk, a toddler has to stand up and take that first step. So this is how humans change and develop and grow and mature. Development is good, and in fact, taking risks is good. Taking risks is necessary. All of us took that first step. All of us, I'm presuming everyone drives, all of us turned that key for the first time. So we all need to take risks. We all need to try new things. That is development. What we need to be careful of, and what's really the challenge here, is when do we take that risk? When do we allow a child to take that first step, to take that first key turn and operate the machinery? So physical development is the easiest way to think about it. And I'm going to talk about several aspects of development. And physical development is probably what most of us think of first. How tall are you? How big are you? How strong are you? Okay, and of course, farm equipment, as most of us know, is designed for adult men. And therefore, when you've got someone who's smaller, and that might be height, that might be how high your eyes are for vision in a tractor, that may be how long your arms are, it may be how strong you are to turn a wheel, to grip something. Whatever it is, when you've got less strength and less size, then obviously it's going to be harder to operate machinery or to do what you're supposed to do safely. But physical development is simple for us to think about, and it's really not what I'm going to focus on today because there's a lot of other aspects of development that are probably equally, if not more important when it comes to being safe in an agricultural setting. So we can next think about perceptual development. So of course here we're talking about perception, and we know that by age 1, very young children are able to perceive the world essentially the same way as adults. Okay, so actually very, very young infants do not perceive color and depth and so forth the same as adults. That does take time to develop, okay, eyesight and perception, but by the ages we're mostly interested in, certainly seeing vision and depth and so forth is the same in adults as it would be in childhood and adolescence. Where it gets trickier is things like estimating your own ability, estimating whether you can jump or leap or reach things, estimating distances. Even adults actually are pretty good at distances, but when it comes to an approaching vehicle, adults are not perfectly accurate at perceiving speeds. Okay, so is a car traveling 50 miles per hour versus 80 miles per hour? A car way off in the distance, we're okay at it, but we're not perfect at it. Okay, and children, of course, are less perfect. And this is something that's developing over time, accelerations, velocities, distances. If you turn to the next slide, this is a schematic of some research I did early in my career with my dissertation mentor, Jody Plummer at Iowa. And if you look at this graph here, these are tasks that children were asked to do in a lab. So, for example, they stood on this platform here with their hands by their side, and they were asked to look. This is like a little toy frog, like a rubber ducky bath toy. And the children were asked, with their hands by their side, can you reach this frog if you were to stand on your tiptoes and reach up over your head? Adults are in the circle here, and when the task was within their ability, they were quite good, but you see adults were about 70% correct when the task was just beyond their ability, about 80% when it was well beyond their ability. Okay? The other tasks, here you crouch down as if you're playing catcher in a baseball game, reach out for the toy duck. These two parallel sticks, you stand behind one stick, can you step over the other stick without jumping? Okay, and this one's almost like a limbo game. You try to get under the bar. Okay, so you've got 4 tasks, and you see adults are quite accurate when it's within and fairly accurate when it's beyond their task. But look at our 6-year-olds in the square here and the 8-year-olds in the diamond, and you see that 6 and 8-year-olds only got about 40% of the time correct when the task was just beyond their ability. So they're overestimating. They're assuming they can do things that they can't do. Well, you transfer this lab task to the real world, and we've done that in pedestrian settings, and you see a very similar pattern in how children judge approaching traffic and how they judge it compared to adults. Okay? We haven't yet transferred this to an agricultural setting, but we're seeing it in a lab, we're seeing it in a pedestrian setting. I'm quite certain we would see this same pattern on a tractor. Next slide, please. So we talked about judging distances, inclines, traffic, and so forth. Next. So let's now turn to cognitive development. This is arguably the most important aspect of safety on a farm. Cognition, of course, refers to thinking. How does one think about the world? And there are so many aspects of cognition and cognitive development that are relevant. But just to give you some examples, attending to relevant stimuli, okay? Many of us can picture that 15-year-old. They're actually pretty good at attending for the first 3 to 5 minutes, right? But how many times have you driven a tractor for 5 minutes and quit? Okay, it almost is utterly ridiculous. Most people, during the time when you're harvesting or what it might be, you're out on the tractor for hours and hours at a time. Adults have trouble attending. Kids have a lot more trouble attending. Thinking about the information you're perceiving, making decisions. So here, for example, in our work in pedestrian safety, and I've done quite a bit of work in a virtual simulator, so computer-driven pedestrian situation, how well do children perceive an oncoming vehicle? And then, how quickly do they decide that it's safe to cross the street? So if you picture a pedestrian setting, you've got 2 cars, one from each direction, and a safe gap appears. Adults often will enter into that near lane of traffic as the vehicle is passing into the far lane. Okay, can you picture that? So you've got 1 lane in each way. You're anticipating a gap will appear. The car is passing in the far lane, and you step down into the near lane because you know the far lane will be empty by the time you get there. Okay, that's adults' ability to consider perceived information and then make a decision and go ahead and enter the road. The younger you go, the less anticipation there is. And at a certain point, roughly age 10 to 12, children aren't anticipating much anymore. Instead, they don't enter the near lane until the car is passed in the far lane. Okay, so it's taking them longer to decide there's going to be a safe gap. And then you go younger, let's say about 8 or 9 or 10, and in fact, there's up to a second or a second and a half delay, and we've looked at this in about 8-year-olds, and they often are delaying for a second and a half. The gap is there. It's a safe time to cross, okay? There's plenty of enough seconds for them to get their bodies across that road, right? And they're waiting a second and a half before they enter the road. Why? Because it's taking them time to make that decision and then to start their body moving, right? Now what happens a second and a half later? The gap is smaller, right? Now the cars are closer because they're going 30 or 40 or 50 miles an hour. They're closer, and therefore you've just created a more dangerous time to cross the road. Okay? I'm sure you can translate that to agricultural settings. As I said, most of my work is in other domains, but I'm sure this would translate. These sorts of processing, considering, making decisions are going to translate to all sorts of situations. Understanding cause and effect, anticipating. What would happen if I did this? Okay? I think of, I dealt with a patient back when I was doing clinical work, a paper shredder, okay, an office paper shredder. Not a good idea to put your hand down into that shredder, right? Well, this young child, and it was an old shredder before they've kind of put in some safety devices, put hand in, and of course this would easily translate to agricultural settings, right? Didn't think about, it's jammed now. But if I get it unjammed, what's the cause and effect? All of a sudden my fingers are inside of very sharp blades, right? And I'll spare you the details of the unfortunate situation for that young child, but you can imagine cause and effect issues, anticipation, and that's what children, even adolescents, are not good at anticipating what will happen if something else happens, Okay, next please. Following directions. We've all dealt with children. We know how good they are at following directions. Remembering rules, okay? And it's easier to remember rules than it is to do what the rules say you should do, right? So often we can teach rules, and in fact, very young children, 3, 4-year-olds, are not bad at learning rules if you drill it into their head enough, right? Transferring remembering rules to understanding why there is a rule and then doing what the rule says. Lots of steps in cognitive development, challenging for children to pull off. Understanding risk, consequences of decisions, and a very key word, especially when we start thinking about adolescent safety and vulnerability. And I'm going to show you some data on this in a moment. Before I do that, I'll just mention executive function. This is kind of a jargon term in psychology. It literally means acting like an executive, planning, organizing, thinking. The sorts of things that a CEO has to do are important to all of our lives, right? And this is probably the last aspect of cognition to develop. There's actually recent research coming from brain scan research that's suggesting that it's not till mid-20s, perhaps roughly age 25, that adults have the capacity to act like adults. Okay, so even at age 21, 22, 23, and we see this on college campuses. Think about the poor planning and thinking and organizing when it comes to alcohol use on college campuses, right? Okay. These skills, the human being simply has not developed to adult levels until the mid-20s in these sorts of skills. So next slide, just to show you a little bit of data and stop talking. This is a sample of 90 students. These are college students, although this would, I'm sure, very much translate down into adolescence. How often do you use mobile internet applications while crossing the street? And by the way, this is a few years ago. It's probably increased since then. Only 11% of college students said they never are on the internet on their phone while they're crossing a busy street. Only 11%. That means 88%, at least sometimes they're crossing a street while they're looking at their phone. And not only are they looking at their phone, they're thinking about what's on their phone. And probably the thinking is as important, if not more important, than where their eyes are, right? They're not looking at the fact that there may be a car approaching. And in fact, that driver may be on their phone as well, right? Okay, so that's why we actually are seeing an increase in pedestrian injuries in our country right now, and I think it's because of this sort of activity by drivers and pedestrians. All right, impulse control. I said it's probably not fully developed until the early 20s. Impulse control is an aspect of executive function. Children are lousy, okay? And the classic task, some of you may know this, is the marshmallow task. And this was done back in probably in the 1970s, maybe even the 60s. Walter Mischel in New York City, he put a marshmallow in front of children and he said, don't eat it and there's various designs for the study, but the classic is, don't eat this for 5 minutes and I'll give you a second one. A lot of the kids grabbed that marshmallow and ate it, right? And it's so funny. I don't know if any of you have seen the videos. There's actually videos of children doing this task, and they're all fidgeting and they'll touch it and they'll smell it, and they're trying their hardest to inhibit desire, right? Now I imagine most of you, and you can replace marshmallow with whatever your favorite treat is, most of you could probably wait 5 minutes if you were going to get a second one, right? Kids can't do this, and you do this with 3-year-olds, and very few of them manage. You get older, and more of them do manage to do it, but even adolescents do struggle with these sorts of tasks, and it's not till our age, I'll use that term loosely, that we actually can manage to inhibit our impulses with reasonable success. Obviously, this is going to translate in so many different ways on farms with so many risks. How do we inhibit desires, inhibit the impatience? How do we get people to wait and stop until something is done safely? All right, let me switch gears now, and developmental psychologists kind of divide the world into perception, cognition, and social development. And so social development, of course, is referring to how we interact with other people. Okay, what are the aspects of socializing that influence our behavior? And we can easily divide this into parents and into other children. So if we start with parents, modeling is probably the most important. We often think first about teaching and educating. How well do parents teach and educate their children? Very, very important, of course. But I would argue that modeling is actually an area where we have a lot of potential to change behavior. My favorite study here, and this was done in the 80s and 90s before seatbelt use was almost routine in our country, but they studied whether teenage drivers were wearing their seatbelt. And this study, they looked at all sorts of variables. You know, they looked at race and gender and age. They looked at what kind of car the kid was driving. They looked at where they were driving, how far they were driving. But do you know what the best predictor of using a kid using a seatbelt was? Do their parents use a seatbelt, right? Modeling is such a powerful influence on human behavior. Okay? And the classic studies here are, some of you may know Albert Bandura's research with Bobo dolls, and this was done out at Stanford. And he would have children watch adults hit a Bobo doll. It was a big blow-up clown balloon kind of doll, life-size, human adult-sized balloon. And the kids that watched an adult hit it, half of the kids watched an adult hit it, half the kids didn't. And then they put the kids in a room full of toys, including Bobo. And you can guess what happened, right? The ones that saw an adult hitting Bobo learned to be aggressive and went into that room and started pummeling the poor doll. Okay? And the ones that didn't see an aggression, no one hit the doll, right? No kids did this naturally. They modeled what they saw. And therefore, if we can get adults on the farm to act safely, we're going to get the kids to act safely. And of course, adults also have influence by setting rules. Now, as we get older, the influence of adults becomes less and the influence of peers, and here we're talking about friends, and I think you could easily transfer that to older siblings and cousins and other kids on the farm. That's your influence. And this is not my research. This is some research done by Larry Steinberg, who's been a leader in this area. And he had them play a video game, a driving game. So here we're getting at safety type issues, a video driving game. When the kids played it alone, here's the crashes: adolescents, young adults, and adults. So adolescents in red, young adults in green, adults in brown. And look at the difference in this graph when they're playing with friends, right? A lot more risks, especially in these adolescents. They're crashing a lot more when their friends are there. Somewhat less in young adults, but I want to note again, these young adults are not perfectly safe. They're nowhere near where the adults were. Okay? The influence of peers is very powerful, especially in adolescence and young adulthood. And I'll close with a discussion of sociocultural factors, and here focusing in our country, technology and media. I mentioned the texting while crossing the street. Kids are on their phones constantly. Any of you have spent any time with adolescents know this, and that's influencing their behavior, and that's influencing their safety, whether it be crossing the street, driving a car, or operating machinery. Fatigue and sleep, and I'm going to show you some of our data on fatigue and sleep. Because they're on their phones halfway into the night, there's actually been it's startling, the change in sleep habits in adolescents in the United States over the last 10 years. Down, 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 down. Adolescents are sleeping less even than they did 10 years ago. Okay, and they weren't sleeping enough 10 years ago. The kids are staying up on their phones, and we know from largely adult research and more with children, not enough sleep really influences you in a lot of ways. It influences your learning in school, but it also influences your attention and concentration on the job. Fashion and hairstyle, we all know about this. You want to wear long hair and you want to wear certain clothes, and that gets caught in machinery. But let me show you some data on sleep. This is a study we did in my lab, again in the virtual pedestrian environment. 55 adolescents aged 14 and 15, just before they learned to drive. Okay, and they crossed our virtual street twice, random order, and one time they had 4 hours of sleep. So we actually had them wear what's called an ActiWatch. It's actually like a wristwatch, and it measures their sleep. It actually measures movement, and so they come into the lab. We know how long they've slept the night before, and then we had them sleep 8.5 hours, which is considered by the pediatricians to be adequate sleep for this age group. Okay, and here's what happened when they crossed the street. How many times they get hit by a vehicle? About twice out of 25 crossings when they were tired. A lot less when they were adequately rested. Okay. Start delay. This is that decision making I talked about. Do you anticipate a safe crossing, or how long do you decide to enter a crossing? And you see a significant difference here. How often were they looking at traffic? Interesting here. When they were tired, they were looking more. So it was almost like they were acutely aware, I'm tired, and they're looking back and forth quite a bit. They may be perceiving, but they're still having a delayed decision. So they're looking, but they're not doing. Right? their brain is only halfway alert. They're looking at what's going on. They're not entering, and they're of course having a shorter time to contact. That's how close the approaching vehicles were. So there's a model in a paper I published a couple years ago with Will Pickett. Some of you may have seen this. And this is a model of what I've just talked about: physical development, cognitive development, social development, perceptual development. The 4 pillars of child development that seem to influence safety on a farm and in many, many other aspects of life. And then the sociocultural influences, which are less developmental, okay, just to phrase that, although they're influenced by adolescents in their development, but aspects of our culture that influence behavior. Altogether, obviously having a major impact on whether it be tractor injuries or other agricultural injuries. So just to summarize, we all know children are dying on farms, children are suffering major injuries on farms. Child development makes a difference, and it is not just size. And I think all of you as professionals know that. I think often parents forget. They think, my kid is big and strong, they're safe. But we know it's not just big and strong. It's what's in their head. It's thinking skills. And I know a lot of big and strong 15-year-olds whose brain is functioning like a 15-year-old or even a 12-year-old. And that's where we need to be thinking beyond strength and size to the processes that go on in a child's development to keep them safe or not safe. Thank you.